Good evening, and welcome to the School of Visual Arts. My name is Jane Nuzzo, and I'm the Director of Alumni Affairs and Development at the college. And on behalf of the SVA Alumni Society, and in partnership with the Will and Ann Eisner Family Foundation, it's my pleasure to bring you tonight's program, Will Eisner's The Spirit 75th Anniversary Celebration. As you know, we have with us two very special guests, Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist and author Jules Feiffer, and former publisher and president of DC Comics Paul Levitz. Yes. And together this evening, they will discuss the enduring legacy of pioneering comic artist and longtime SVA faculty member, beloved faculty member, Will Eisner. In case you don't know, yes. In case you're not aware, the proceeds from tonight's ticket sales will benefit the SVA Alumni Society's Will Eisner Sequential Art Fund. Established in 2008 by the Will and Ann Eisner Family Foundation, the fund's scholarships annually support SVA students whose work is in sequential art, a term coined by Eisner to describe comics and graphic storytelling. I'd like to thank you all this evening for helping to sustain this meaningful scholarship for our students and in honor of Will Eisner. And as a reminder, following tonight's conversation and Q&A, please join us in the lobby for a book signing. Both Mr. Feiffer and Mr. Levitz will be available to sign a selection of publications, and an array of titles by Eisner, Feiffer, and Levitz will also be available for purchase. And I'd like to thank the SVA campus store for their participation in hosting tonight's book signing. I would also like to give special thanks to Carl and Nancy Gropper of the Eisner Foundation. I want to thank them for their extraordinary efforts in bringing you tonight's program. And finally, I have to acknowledge our sponsors. The Society is extremely grateful for the very generous support of this evening's event sponsors. And I would like to especially recognize our spirit-level sponsors for the program, DC Entertainment and Treport. Thank you. And now it's my pleasure to begin the program with a brief screening, courtesy of the Society of Illustrators.
Will Eisner enjoyed a long, highly productive, and ever-innovative career. He was still at his studio drawing board 5 days a week, with no diminution of skills, when he died with his 88th birthday approaching. Eisner's bold artistry and imaginative storytelling made him one of the great masters of comics and graphic novels. In the mid-1930s, the teenage Eisner quickly established himself as a prime talent at the birth of the comic book industry in New York. With his instinctive knack for business, even at age 20, he co-founded the Eisner and Iger studio with older partner Jerry Iger to package comics for publishers hungry to feed the market for cheap entertainment during the Great Depression. Initially, Eisner worked in a 10-foot square office, churning out comic stories under many pseudonyms to create the illusion that the studio had a stable of artists. Over time, Eisner hired many future legends: Jack Kirby, Liv Fine, Bob Powell, Bob Kane, just to name a few. While drawing, writing, editing, and overseeing his artists, Eisner also came up with original creations like Blackhawk, Dollman, and Sheena, Queen of the Jungle. At 22, Eisner was approached by a mid-sized newspaper syndicate looking to launch a new comic property. Intrigued by the opportunity to focus on his single creation and to reach a larger, mature audience, Eisner agreed to sell his half of the lucrative Eisner and Iger studio, but on one condition. Eisner insisted on a deal that would give him ultimate ownership of the new feature. His prospective partners, Busy Arnold of Quality Comics and the owners of the Des Moines Register and Tribune Syndicate, ultimately capitulated, and The Spirit was launched in the summer of 1940 as an innovative 16-page insert in Sunday newspapers. Eisner wrote and drew a 7 or 8 page Spirit story every week, overseeing the remaining features. Eisner had earlier pioneered the use of splash pages to dramatize opening pages, grabbing readers' attention, but he took splashes to new heights in the spirit. His artistic use of typography was part of the strip's groundbreaking visuals. Ironically, this unpredictable variation of the logo became a Spirit trademark in itself. Ostensibly a masked detective story, the Spirit defied genre boundaries. Eisner's versatile style and mastery of camera angles allowed him to maximize realism. His femme fatales are among the sexiest in comics, and often other cast members took front stage in plots. Eisner was a lifelong innovator of what he called sequential art. Harvey Kurtzman, himself a giant in the field, called Eisner the greatest of the early comic book artists. In 1942, Eisner's direct involvement in the Spirit was interrupted by his World War II service, but that career detour led to his pioneering work in another area, educational comics. As a chief warrant officer at the Pentagon, he produced humorous, inspirational posters, as well as comics-based how-tos in firepower and Army motors. Eisner left the Army, returning to the Spirit in late '45 and continuing till 1952, but in 1948 he founded a new company, American Visuals, to supply custom educational comics for clients from the U.S. government to General Motors. And for 2 full decades, from 1951 on, he worked again for the U.S. Army, producing PS, the Preventive Maintenance Monthly magazine. In 1971, around the time he was leaving PS, he discovered Underground Comics, produced by young hippie cartoonists for their pot-smoking counterculture peers, and fully expected to shock and repulse any middle-aged person. Eisner, then 54, was briefly repulsed, but he also showed characteristic curiosity about this new development in his medium. The Underground model had much that appealed: complete editorial freedom, no subject restriction, creator-owned copyrights, royalties, not flat rates, original art kept by the artists, and the comics sold on a non-return basis. In 1978, Eisner finished an ambitious work, 4 interrelated Bronx tenement stories. The cover of A Contract with God proclaimed it a graphic novel. Its heft and binding made it a book, not a comic book. Bookstores carried it, not just comic book shops. Part painful autobiography with sexual frankness, literary pretensions, and characters of ambiguous morality, A Contract with God inspired countless ambitious cartoonists to think outside the comics box. Graphic novels soon became the fastest growing form of literature, with a substantial section in nearly every bookstore. In between A Contract with God in 1978 and The Plot, published posthumously in 2005, Eisner created nearly 20 additional graphic novels, at an age when most of his contemporaries had long retired. Late in his career, he also enjoyed teaching at New York's School of Visual Arts. His experience with students helped him to develop 3 astute how-to textbooks on sequential art, graphic storytelling, and expressive anatomy, all of which remain in wide use. Since the late 1980s, the best-known awards for excellence in comics are the Eisner Awards, presented annually at the San Diego Comic-Con. But as much as he enjoyed seeing his own name used to distinguish mostly younger award winners, he never forgot those who came before him. Illustrators such as J.C. Leyendecker and cartoonists like Milton Caniff and Elzie Segar in particular were big influences on Eisner, and the ranks of the Society of Illustrators embodied his heroes. Nothing would please him more than being inducted into its Hall of Fame.
And now let's get to the main part of the evening. Here to introduce tonight's conversation is eminent American graphic designer, art director, art critic, and author Stephen Heller. For over 30 years, Heller held the position of senior art director at the New York Times Book Review. He is a prolific author with books tracing the history of typography, illustration, and other subjects related to graphic design. Currently, he is the co-chair with Lita Tallarico of the MFA Designer as Author program at the School of Visual Arts, which he also helped co-found. Before that, for 14 years in the MFA Illustration as Visual Essay program at SVA, he lectured on the history of illustration. Salient to this evening, Heller both met and spent time with Will Eisner when he commissioned both Stan Lee and Eisner to draw comic strips for the New York Times op-ed page. And he has known Jules Feiffer personally for over 35 years. Please join me in welcoming Stephen Heller.
So for a few months during the late 1960s, I was enrolled in the illustration program here at SVA. My dream was to become an illustrator, cartoonist, and make underground comics. My heroes were Jules Feiffer, Harvey Kurtzman, and Will Eisner. The two later taught here, Eisner from 73 to 92, which was much too late for me. And Kurtzman was here, but I was not good enough to take the class with him, so I left the school to pursue other things. In fact, I was kicked out. Fortunately, however, a few years later, I became the art director of the New York Times op-ed page, and one of the first commissions I gave out was to Harvey on the development of Alfred E. Neuman. A few years after that, I asked Will Eisner to do a strip about the spirit, and he came up with Richard Nixon, the spirit thereof, haunting the Republican convention in New York. And around the same time, I got to know Jules while working with him on his book celebrating his 25th anniversary of voice comic strips. Needless to say, I've been privileged to know all of them. So when asked to introduce tonight's special conversation about Will Eisner between Jules, who worked for Eisner, and Paul Levitz, who has written beautifully about Eisner, I jumped at the opportunity, if only to come and listen to them. So by way of introduction, I still have my tattered copy of Jules's book, The Great Comic Book Heroes, and my well-paged copy of his wonderful memoir, Backing Into Forward. Every chance I get, I show my students the 1960 animated version of Monroe, the satiric tale of a pint-sized kid conscripted into the U.S. Army. But that's only 1% of my Feiffer collection. I also have some indelible memories after all these years. Notably, the opening night of Jules's Broadway performance of Grown Ups, sitting behind the three top masthead editors of the Times, when one turned to me after the lead character, Jake, announced to his mother, Helen, and father, Jack, that he was quitting the New York Times. That's when managing editor Arthur Gelb turned to me and said, "Tell Feiffer we love this play." I may have forgotten to tell you. Gelb ended up ordering 3 major stories about the play. I've been avidly reading Paul's Will Eisner Champion of Graphic Novel book. It's a fantastic book that addresses Eisner with some warts and all. The book is a real keeper for its text and its art, a lot of which are original. Paul transitioned from comics writer to comics executive, which may be every comic geek's dream life. By the way, he's the author of Taschen's 75 Years of DC Comics, which I will read once I can find somebody to lift it onto my lap. Again, it's so great to have both of you here, and it's a privilege for all of us to hear you share your thoughts and lives with Will Eisner. So please welcome Jules Feiffer and Paul Levitz.
Which one of us is Paul Levitz?
The younger, less handsome one.
My God.
What a pleasure, Jules. Thank you for coming this evening.
What a pleasure to be asked, and what a wonderful idea this is, and what a wonderful and moving send-off, but mainly moving because of the extraordinary piece of work you've accomplished. When the book came in the mail sent by Abrams Abel and brilliant editor Charlie Kochman, I had no idea. I mean, I knew Paul had been working on this for a long time. He came out to my home at the time in Southampton to interview me and talk about Eisner and all of that. I knew he was working on it, but I had no idea how strongly it would affect me. And nothing I've read on comics has had as much as an effect on me since I read the extraordinary Michael Chabon's The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay.
But that's only fair, Jules, because I'm not the only person sitting here for whom your great comic book heroes affected us as really the first piece of comic book history taking the subject seriously. For a long time, the most stolen book out of the Brooklyn library system, at least. I'm not saying a word about personal behavior in that fashion, but I can turn in a great number of my friends.
It never stayed in libraries very long.
I understand they have a separate statute of limitations. Librarians are very, very wise, but occasionally strict people. But that book set the tone for doing history about comics and reminding us that, in fact, it was a subject worthy of history.
Well, I wasn't interested, when Ed Doctorow, E.L. Doctorow, who later and shortly thereafter became famous as a brilliant American novelist, came up with the idea for the book and the title, and came up with me as the writer of it. He couldn't imagine anyone else, he said, who could write well and convincingly on the subject. And I said I could only do it if we forgot about scholarship, and I wrote, in essence, a fan's notes on the book, and talked about the early comics from comic books that meant so much to me. From Siegel and Schuster and their early work on, in Beyond Superman, on Federal Men and Spy, and most importantly, Slam Bradley. And I adored, Joe Shuster's art has been plowed under very, very often, but he was a marvel at a sense of immediacy, of action. He was a true and noble purveyor of the cartoon arts, and I loved having the chance to write about both of them, but particularly Joe Shuster. And I loved the chance to write about the nutty, impossible career of the barely talented Bob Kane, and who made it work anyhow. I mean, it's interesting how a lot of people, cartoonists who couldn't draw, were somehow very effective. Harold Gray, who did Little Orphan Annie, was a master at as much or more than anyone else at creating tension on a page and atmosphere on a page and brilliant build-up of storyline on a page.
But let's move to a more talented cartoonist.
What's that?
We're here to talk about Will tonight. And in a sense, that's kind of bizarre. It's 75 years since the dawn of the Spirit. It says so right up there. It's over 50 years since the end of the Spirit. And normally, cartoonists, creative artists in pretty much all fields have kind of a half-life. Once they stop creating, the world remembers them for a while and then remembers them historically, but the level of passion, the aura created by their work fades a little. In comic books specifically, that's been defied mostly by people like Jerry and Joe and Bob Kane, who created characters that lived on brilliantly in the hands of other wonderfully talented people. And if we still care about Superman or Batman, part of it is because not only the brilliance of the original creation, but the layers that have been added onto it so much by subsequent caretakers, making it modern for each time. Will didn't have that benefit. Most of his work was of its moment and its time. He comes back for that second burst with Contract with God and the graphic novels, but even that's a good few years ago now. We're talking about Contract is 1978, so we're talking about almost 4 decades ago. Why is it that Will is such an enduringly powerful creative figure?
Well, even before that break in time, my experience with him goes back even earlier than that, because I became aware of Will, first in comic books, but the Spirit early on in its, within the first few months of its origins, and it was groundbreaking in its storytelling, in its characters, in its humor, in its originality and style in every possible way. And then he got drafted, and it was over for 3 years. I mean, far less able cartoonists, first trying to imitate his style, and then, like Lou Fine, who took it over, moving into their own style more or less, did the best they could, and the best was often not so good to pitifully inadequate. And the Spirit, I stopped reading it because it was not very interesting. Then Will came back in '46, I guess it was, and took it over again, and it was a whole new Eisner in a whole new look and a whole new approach, as a way of storytelling and graphically. It was an extension of what he had done earlier, but it was eons better.
Part of what I posit in the book, I came to believe was the theory. As a young man, he lived a fairly closed life. It was a Jewish immigrant community. Artists, as you know from your life, as I know from my time as a writer, don't leave home much. You do most of your work if you're locked in your room at a drawing board or at a keyboard. And I think the Will Eisner who went off to the Army had spent some time with other artists, certainly, with a few writers, but he was not very experienced of the world. He came back a very different human being, I think a much richer human being with a much richer view of the world.
Well, there was, I think that's probably true. There was greater dimension and density. If you look at the different spirits in the artwork, and that also has something to do with the assistants he had working for him on backgrounds, and but he had assistants in the early years too. Whatever the assistants did, Will was the mastermind and a true creator of it all. And while the layout and artwork and storytelling effects are shocking and original in the early spirits, in post-war, more than any other time, he became a master of atmosphere. I guess the noir films had emerged, or begun to emerge, during Will's time in the Army and after the Army, and when he started up again. And he started doing these movies on paper, and where you had a sense of experience in the tough, wonderful, gritty reality of the page. It didn't look like anybody else's work. The stories didn't sound like anybody else. The voice, the whole atmosphere was particularly his. It was totally new and original, and although a lot of it was based on movies that we all saw, but how he transformed all of this was, for me, as an ambitious young cartoonist and who hero-worshipped Will, it was stunning, shocking.
I want to pick up on something very specific in what you said there. There's an enormous discussion that's gone on in comics in the last couple of decades about what's come to be termed the difference between artisanal creation of comics, where there is the same cartoonist as the writer and the artist working passionately on their own work, and what's come to be termed the industrial way of doing it, which is the descendant of things like Eisner and Iger, the shop where you have a writer, you have an artist in collaboration. And there's a certain academic derision of the industrial method versus the artisanal method. As someone who can't draw and has always relied on collaboration, I've always had astronomical respect for the creator who can do it all, but I've also had great respect for the collaborative teams where the boundary was either seamless or 1 and 1 equaled a just larger one. You've spoken to me and to others from time to time about Will as an auteur, and the Spirit was done by many hands, yourself included. You wrote many scripts as you matured as an assistant working with him, but you've always looked back and said, but it was Will's voice. How was that possible that his voice could pervade all of those hands and it not feel like shop work?
The answer is I don't know, but it worked. When I first went to him in 1946, he was in the outer office working with a brush and just doing some spirit heads, parts of heads and parts of bodies, and the rest he turned over to the guys in the other room. That included John Spranger, who was his penciler, who was an extraordinary draftsman, in fact, a better draftsman than Will, and to Sam Rosen, who was the lettering man. I forget who did backgrounds at the
Jerry
time.
Grandinetti?
No, it was before Jerry.
Before Jerry?
Because Jerry came in after I was there.
Okay.
And, but Will's sensibility, Will's persona, I think Will's basic passion for and devotion to the craft permeated the work of all of these other very proficient draftsmen and craftsmen, all of whom were brilliant, and I dare say none of them were artists. There was only one artist, real artist in the room, and that was Eisner, and his sensibility, by force of, first of all, his expertise, he knew everything. Whether he did it or not, he knew how everything worked, how everything was supposed to look, and unlike many cartoonists, he communicated beautifully, and simply and directly. He understood every aspect of this form, and he treated it with great seriousness of craft, and and I think that's what made it all seem like the work of one man, because it's impossible to turn out 8 pages a week alone. You can't do it, but he made it look like it was one man, and I know when I started writing scripts for the Spirit, for me the conceit in all this excitement for me was, how do I make this sound like Eisner while sneaking in Feiffer here? But I knew that my job and my responsibility, and I would have been ashamed of myself if I'd been derelict in it, was to make this feel and sound like an Eisner story.
That leads to a question that our mutual friend Nick Meglin sent in as a suggestion for me. Nick was for those of you who don't know, was the longtime co-editor of Mad Magazine and the author of perhaps 20 different books on art and particularly humorous illustration. Nick wanted to know your thoughts on how, as a young man apprenticed to a master of that level of skill, you managed to get your point of view. How did you argue with Will for what you believed in?
I never argued. I argued later on, but in the beginning, for some reason or other, from boyhood in a nice Jewish family in the Bronx, and dealing with a dominating mother and a dominating sister, I've had the instinct of a subversive. I never won in my life in my family an argument head on, so I'd have to do it all on the sly. So I knew I guess I knew by instinct what I needed to give Will to make the story work for him, and what I wanted to sneak in for me so that I could also overthrow the government a little. Because Will's politics were very different from mine, and by hook or crook, I was going to sneak in some of mine.
Well, I think we still might need some of that overthrowing the government stuff. You might keep working on that. There's
I did overthrow the government with very mixed results, as you can tell.
I think it was Jefferson who said we needed a revolution every 20 years. We might need a dose of Pfeiffer every 20 years to remind us.
That's why we're going to elect Donald Trump, is that it?
Please. But the sheer mention of Donald Trump, besides requiring that we provide some Claritin for everybody's allergic reaction in this room, all of us have our politics seep into our creative work. We can't help it. Whether it's something we absorbed in our home growing up, you've written eloquently about the socialism that pervaded the atmosphere around you as you were growing, the liberalism that surrounded me in a gentler era. it comes through. Our attitudes towards humanity are a part of our writing. You had very different politics, as you say, from Will. Where do you feel his politics came in the spirit? Where did your politics come in? And does that become a conscious process at that stage? Obviously, it was a very conscious process for you when you moved on to the editorial cartooning and the Village Voice and a much more political set of work. But even in things like the spirit.
Well, when I was a kid, there was something like the spirit. It was the spirit. And before that, there was Eisner's earlier work, which I also loved. I was devoted to. There was also Milton Caniff's Terry and the Pirates, which was a groundbreaking explosion of storytelling talent and art operating at the highest level of the comics could attain at that time. And there was other work also at that time that I could admire, so that I came into the business as a fan of the business at a very young age, 8, 9, 10, or even earlier than that, with the dream of becoming one of these guys who I thought were the be-all and end-all. I mean, that no status interested me other than the status of becoming on par with Al Capp and Milton Caniff and Will Eisner and Alex Raymond. I mean, these were great men for me. Will was starting from another position entirely. There was something to be ashamed of in being a cartoonist. He found in his time, in his culture, and in his family. And as alive, experimental, and as original as he was, as groundbreaking as he was, he knew what he could do. He knew it, but as monumentally extraordinary his talent was, I think there was always an insecurity that he was not doing a respectable thing. I mean, you talked in your book, and you made the brilliant point of the businessman Eisner pleasing his mother and the artist Eisner pleasing his father.
Not original to me. Some of his other biographers have said that earlier, but I think that dichotomy is definitely a piece of what's gone on.
And I think unlike me and perhaps others, Will always had a sense of being the best in a business that wasn't quite good enough to be the best in. And he talked and wrote about being in a conversation. I think he told me this too as a kid, with some people at a party, and they were having an interesting conversation until the man asked what Will did, and he said he was a comic book artist, and then the guy walked away. It didn't matter how smart Will was, and Will was extraordinarily intelligent, or how good the conversation was. It's people who basically aren't sure of themselves or how bright they are, depend on what they've acquired and what their status is. And if I'm in Wall Street, I'm automatically smarter than any dopey cartoonist. And most of the dopey cartoonists I know take pride in their dopiness, in their eccentricity. I mean, Irwin Hazen, the great Irwin Hazen, took joy in being
in being Irwin Hazen.
Being Irwin Hazen. But Will, and in his work as a cartoonist, Will didn't have that kind of joy. He just was a better artist than anyone else, but something in it prevented him until he got to the serious graphic novels where he could deal, he thought, with more serious themes. That he had to prove that the craft he had helped invent and perfect deserved attention by finding important enough subject matter to present itself in. And of course, there was the personal story of his own life, as you eloquently write about.
Well, I think one of the things that came to me as I was working on the book, Will had always articulated the Gerhard Schnabel story as his favorite, and was a favorite of mine. I always thought it was beautifully done. But in parsing his story and looking at his journey striving for personal respect, striving for respect for his medium.
Outline the story.
Sorry, Gerhard Schnabel, for those of you who haven't had the fun of it, is the story of a little man who's able to fly, but doesn't, until one day he finally flies, but no one notices, and he is shot completely by accident in the middle of his flight and brought to earth and dies. But at least he had flown for that moment. But the sadness was, of course, that no one had noticed.
Nobody cared.
And in looking at that story through the lens of putting Will's story together for the book, it struck me that perhaps the reason that was Will's favorite, and the story is from 1947, 1948, period when you were working with him, that Will saw himself as Schnabel, that he had flown. The Spirit was this absolute work of art at that point, and he knew he was flying, and no one in the world cared.
When I read that in your book, after being pissed off that I had not thought of it, at the same time it moved me close to tears because it felt so right and so sad that a man of such enormous gift should feel this way. These were not illegitimate feelings; they were quite legitimate. But the sad thing about Will is that he always felt that the critics had a point. It's in backing into forward my memoir about my life and my career. I say in the epigraph, because I write about failure and the joys of failure, and after that, I add, never let your judge, to my children and their children, never let your judges define you. And that's what so many people do, and I think that's what Will did to some extent. He fought against it, but it always came back to haunt him. What are they saying? What's my reputation? What's my status? Why can't I get a notable book publisher, Random House, or Knopf, or Simon & Schuster to publish me instead of comic book publishing? There was always, these were things to be pissed off about and angry about, but they weren't things to feel inferior about, and I think he had both going on.
I think that's true. I mean, even at the end of his career, the conversations we had when he started being published by Norton, and he wanted to bring his backlist over there, and we worked out an innovative deal because he was always an innovative businessman to do it. The conversation was, Paul, I need to be published by a real New York publisher who's able to get it in the Times Book Review and get it taken seriously. And I was saying at the time, we're going to get there, Will. We're learning how to do all of that as a publishing house. I think in the next couple of years that'll happen. He said, well, I may not have a couple of years. So, help an old man and let's figure out how to get this done. But that was enormously important to him. Even then, when, by every standard within his own industry, he was perhaps the most celebrated figure within the industry.
Well, let's talk about that, because that doesn't happen. Will was completely forgotten, and he completely forgot himself as the artist. He was a businessman, and
you're talking about in the period, the mid-1950s and into the 1960s.
Yes. And as a businessman, he never thought he'd be a cartoonist again. And then through a string of events, which you write about wonderfully in the book, he picks up a career that he hadn't touched in, 15, 20 years?
Yeah.
And he does it in a whole new framework, totally original, very, very exciting. Some of the stuff works, most of it works, some of the stuff doesn't. It always struck me, it says this Jewish boy writing and drawing about tenement life and the life of Jews, whenever he touches on a cartoonist who represents Eisner, he looks like Denny Colt.
We all have our idealizations of ourselves.
And it's not, it's the assimilated Irish-American wasp-looking Jew. But he creates this thing, and I forget the point I was about to make. Once again.
Well, he returns to being a cartoonist. It's clearly the pain of the death of his daughter, Alice, and the destruction, basically, of his nuclear family that comes out of that fires contract with God. And I hate to subscribe to the theory that suffering is the prime root of great art, but it's not a bad tool for art. And certainly in Will's case, I think it was what pushed him beyond what he had ever done before, brilliant as he had been before.
I wouldn't call it suffering. I think it's more like coming to terms with yourself.
Okay.
How do I go on living? How do I make a life worthwhile, which had a great point to it, which it was this great nuclear family. And one important part of that, and his son too, the breakdown of his son, suddenly it's gone. So what's the point? Why should I go on? Who cares? And that became, and what who cared was the therapy was he stopped being the businessman and became the artist again, because the business and making money and having success as a publisher, working for the Army and other places like that, simply, and he always liked that stuff, but it was not simply, it wasn't good enough. It wasn't enough of him. The only thing that was organically him was what he was in the first place from the day he was born, which was a cartoonist. And he had to get back to that. And he had to find a way of getting, and the reason of getting back to it was not to start doing the spirit again, which was not, who cares? You know, it wasn't serious enough. It wasn't, he'd done that, but to try something new. And to give himself a reason for living. And that's why he went, I suspect, he went back to the form that made him what he was in the first place and makes us be here this evening.
So I have a question for you about the form, and then we'll let the audience have a shot at some questions. You are, I think, inarguably the most diversely acclaimed and accomplished person to have worked in comics. We've had incredibly talented, creative people working in the field of comics over the years, but none of them, as far as I can recall, have worked in as many different media forms as you have. Won whatever the Oscar or Pulitzer was for each different form that you touched along the way. You started out loving comics. You've come back at this stage in your career when you have the freedom to do many, many different kinds of things, to comics again, to do graphic novels. Can you put into words what the magic of comics as a media form is? Why it is so special to so many of us? What is the essence of its power that differentiates it from all these other forms?
Well, I think, first of all, my trajectory, the other people in the business suffered from the disease of competence. I was incompetent in so many areas in a field that I loved and adored. I mean, that as long as I could remember as a kid, I wanted to be both Eisner and Kniff and Al Capp and Roy Crane and who else there was around, Craig Flessel when he was doing those wonderful covers. And I wanted to be those guys. I couldn't draw that way. And I couldn't ink with a brush. I mean, all of the things that made my insane ambition to be on the level of the men that I admired most, all of that went for naught because I was lousy. I mean, I just didn't have the drawing skills. I knew how to draw a figure, but I didn't know how to draw a finished figure. I could do it in pencil, But when I tried to ink it, make it look for it was a mess. And when I was working for Eisner and laying out, when he gave me some things to do, like backgrounds, it was, so essentially, because other people who wanted to do this work knew how to do this work, learned how to do this work, and I, who wanted to do this work, never learned how to do this work, I had to become a political and social satirist who overthrew the government. I mean, I was
Tough work, but someone had to do it.
I mean, basically, I couldn't make a living doing the work I wanted to do in the first place. So I backed into doing other work, which gave me the reputation that I've traded on ever since to do anything I felt like it. I mean, that's the wonderful accident. And then the other accident, again, is based on incompetence, getting old. And I'll be 87 in January. Moving out to the Hamptons in the 80s, my hearing gone, my breathing troubled because I have asthma, my inability to walk a block. I used to walk blocks in the city and make notes and write things, and all of that was gone. All of the things that made me write plays. What's the point in writing a play if you can't listen to your own play in rehearsal? I mean, all of these, so I'd sit in my house then in Southampton, figuring out what the hell to do, because I had to make a living, because I didn't have enough money to simply coast on royalties. And it came to me that I'd read some kind of hard-boiled cop novel, and I figured I could do that in a couple of months, and I knew the writing style. I had grown up loving as much as Eisner. I'd loved Hammett and Raymond Chandler and the movies based on their work, and James Cain. So I thought, I'll do that, and I spent 3 days starting a story, and it was lousy. I was bored with it. So I thought, okay, well, why don't I turn it into, a graphic novel. Some wonderful work had begun being done, and serious work. And this was not going to be serious for me. It was just a way of making a buck and moving ahead. And since I couldn't draw in this style, I was going to write the script, and some other artists would draw it. Except when I went to Norton and spoke to Bob Weil, he insisted that I do some sample pages. And I discovered at the age of 80, I could draw in a way that I couldn't draw when I was 15, 20, 25. That implements that pretended to be a brush but weren't, and acted like a pencil, which I could draw with, saved my ass and saved my career and gave me a new one. So I could now become what Roy Crane was and Milton Caniff was and Will Eisner was, become an adventure strip cartoonist, and at the same time, because I had written movies and screenplays and plays, I could use the dialogue and approach and plot machinations of a true writer, of a playwright. And so I could bring all of these forms that I'd worked in, most of them that I'd gotten into by accident or trying to pick up from the ashes something, and bring it all together. And my God, it not only worked, but it became, because I could act for the first time on my earliest boyhood ambitions, it became about the happiest experience in my later life, and even for that matter, maybe my entire life. I mean, I am now not a playwright anymore. I'm not a satirical cartoonist. I'm a graphic novelist, and this is the form that I intend to work and play in, as long as I'm able to pick up a pen and still have half a brain to figure out a storyline.
The rate you're going, I think that will be a very long time, Jules.
One has to hope.
I will be quite content to be a fraction as sharp when I get to your age. It will require me getting sharper than I am now.
Well, happiness helps. It helps when you love what you do. I mean, because I'm acting out. We all have these dreams as a kid. And mine, in a way, worked out, but not in the way I wanted it to. Now it's exactly what I wanted.
That's a wonderful
Go figure.
thing. For ease of recording this, if you have questions, we'd like you to come. There's 2 mics, one over there, one over there. If you would walk up to the mics, those of you who have questions. Hopefully some of you do. And you'll have an opportunity to move this discussion in directions you're curious about. Is that Arlen standing there?
That's me. Hey, Paul.
Hey, Arlen. What do you got for us, Arlen?
Well, hi, Mr. Feiffer.
Hi.
Just like Paul talked about, great comic book heroes was such a foundation of my youth. When we heard that there was a book about comic books in the Fairlawn Public Library, it was like discovering treasure, in the library. But I'm curious, as we got to learn about the Spirit years later through the Warren reprints and all that, and know about the post-war Spirit, how is it that you ended up publishing in Great Comic Book Heroes an early Eisner story versus one of the great post-war Eisner stories?
Good question.
I thought about that. I thought there was something essentially wrong about putting into the book stories I had worked on or stories I had something to do with. I wanted to, since all of the great comic book heroes was about my feelings as a kid when I first discovered these characters and these heroes and writing about them in mini essays about what made them work and what was silly about them and what was strong about them and what was artful about them. It was the early Spirit and particularly the early splash pages, which you write so brilliantly about in your book. And especially that one
Yes.
in
was a gorgeous
Egypt or
pic.
wherever it was. I thought I wanted to be pure to the thing that drove me to write the book in the first place, which is the pure experience of loving the form.
Right.
And that had to do with the innocence and ambition, of course, but the innocence that grabbed me and beset me when I looked at the Spirit for the first time. The excitement when I first saw Shelley Mayer's Scribbly and identified completely with that character as a boy cartoonist, as did my friend and the great caricaturist for New York Review, David Levine. We would sit and talk about Scribbly, the two of us, two left-wing cartoonists. and that in these early forms, which also, all of which had great crudity, not nearly the finish in art you see today, but there was an energy in Schuster's movement, in Bill Everett's Submariner,
Right.
These
Energy.
things seem to explode, and for that matter, in Slam Bradley, which I found graphically more interesting most of the time than the Superman stories.
Really?
That was another Siegel and Schuster.
But was that particular Spirit story like your first Spirit story? Because, the other stories in the book were mostly the origin stories of the characters. You didn't print the origin story of the Spirit. It wasn't even like a central city. It was the Spirit
Well, the origin story in the Spirit was really
Morocco
not
or
very
something.
interesting, and the artwork in the Dr. Cobra episode, which begins it, was not notable for that. None of that early look. It took several months for Eisner to become Eisner,
Right.
and strongly connected to that was the evolution of the splash page, of which no one saw anything like it before, and very little like it since.
Right.
What's followed that's like it since is clearly owes its debt to what
Yes,
Will did.
yes. And you see in Paul's book over and over and over, you see reprints from the Spirit, which are shocking in their originality, in layout. The two-page fight scene between.
That was a wonderful scene.
Yes, and the graphics, the type as it's laid in is remarkable.
And that's 1940 and 1941. It's so early, but that first version of the Dr. Cobra story is pretty awful visually. I make the comparison in the book by showing how he redid it himself when he came back from the army. So I think that was a very sensible choice to dodge that.
So I wanted to show. I wasn't interested in a format for my book, just doing origin stories. I did the origin stories when they were the most interesting, how does Superman become Superman? How does Batman become Batman? Particularly Batman. and his parents getting shot in the street. As you know, and seeing the influences of Bob Kane as he's drawing, you know, a story, and you can see the cartoonist he's swiping from. Here it's Milton Caniff. Here it's a Big Little Book illustrator Henry Vallely. You know, and they look different. The swipes look like a different artist. You know, and the same thing with Shelley Moldoff on the Hawkman. You know, that
Doing very much.
and,
Alex
and
Raymond's
rather than
wife,
put this down, I was going, I love this stuff. I mean, I was crazy about how these guys just swiped back and forth, and they didn't worry about making it consistent or look. You know, it never even occurred to them, or they didn't have time.
Well, it was there were no rules. It was such an it was such an exciting period, clearly. And you talk to any of the guys from that period, and I've been very lucky to have been able to be friends with so many of them along the journey, and it just they were making it all up
Yes.
along the way.
And that's what Chabon captures so brilliantly in Cavalier and Clay, for somebody who wasn't born until after all of this was over.
A lot leaning on Will on that. Have we other
Anyway,
questioners coming up?
Thanks, Mr. Feiffer, for your work all these years. You're great. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
Thanks, Harlan. Hello.
Hello there. Mr. Pfeiffer, a question about...
David.
Yes, hi there.
Can you talk a little louder?
Sure.
I'm deaf.
Could you speak about Will Eisner as an employer? I know you discussed that he didn't pay you a lot, but beyond that, how
Didn't
was
pay
he
a
as an
lot.
Oh, very little. But as an
He
employer,
paid
how...
schmutz. He happily agreed how cheap he was, so you couldn't really gain on him that way. But it was he was absolutely and totally companionable as an employer. He was collegial. I can't remember many times, or maybe any time, that he pulled rank on me. And I was the office wise guy. And I said things and did, I mean, I cannot believe the
That you weren't
chutzpah I
beaten?
had and the irresponsibility. I mean, I must have risked my job by my big mouth several times a week. And he never paid attention, or it didn't seem to bother him. But I did think it affected him in later years when I started developing my own reputation. And there must have been this big balloon over his head which just said, "What?" Because I remained this loudmouth, obnoxious kid who just didn't said these things. And all through it though, his patience was enormous, and I think more than my lack of skills in the office, until I started coloring the spirit, which I was good at, and then became the writer, which I was better at. More than that, or as much as that, he could have a conversation with me. My love for comics equaled his love for comics, and nobody who worked for him loved comics in that fashion. For them, it was a job, and they were much better at their jobs than I would ever be at that particular job. And they weren't even devoted to Eisner or his work. I was amazed to hear some of them in his office, John Spranger and the others, talk about Will's work as being old-fashioned. He was dated. He was okay before the war, but now we've moved on. And I thought of him as a revolutionary figure. And I thought they were absolutely nuts, but they were at the top of their craft, as they were nuts. So Will could talk about comics with me, and we could argue politics, and we could do this and talk about books. We could have a conversation that he could only have with Marilyn Mercer, who was in the front of the office, and later Abe Koenigson, who came on as his lettering man and then background man. We were the office conversationalists, but mostly it was me.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Mine is for you. Tell me if my assumptions are wrong, because I'm not a.
Speak into the mic, please.
Tell me if my assumptions are wrong, but
Can you bring the mic down? I can't hear a word you're saying.
I was always I felt that you came up more in the writing end of the business. And at what point did writers of comics gain the prestige of the artists? And was there a point there where that turned, and also then you went on to the business end, and then you came back to the writing end? And I was wondering if you could relate that to your early experiences.
Sure. Certainly, Stan Lee's prominence at Marvel, and his extraordinary skill both at self-promotion and at promotion of Marvel and of the medium, was a breakthrough moment for writers in the field. Prior to Stan, the role of the writer was a much quieter role.
Or non-existent.
Or non-existent, or often not credited. Bill Finger comes to mind, obviously, as a ghostwriter for so many years. When the direct market, the comic shop market emerged, the assumption was that the artist was the more significant selling point in comics. And generally that was true at that period. As we moved into the 1980s, when the direct market both became the largest market for comics, but also you had the emergence of some extraordinary writing voices, Alan Moore really as perhaps the singular breakthrough in that. People started following writers in a way that they had not before. And that began to tip the balance. A very big piece of that, and you see that continuing now, my belief at least, there was a lovely discussion like this between Junot Diaz and Neil Gaiman earlier this week. And Neil spoke about his choice of doing comics as saying, well, there'd been like 300 years of novels. Prose novels were fairly well explored, but I was coming to comics at a time when it was mostly a jungle, and I could take a machete and carve out a fresh spot. I think writers for the last 20 years in comics have had an extraordinary joy in carving away that jungle and doing things that were not done before. That could be stylistically. Frank, you still in the room? The awesomely talented Frank Miller, who helped prove out the importance of the graphic novel. But wonderful as Frank is as an artist, and he's extraordinary at it, I think if you go back and you look at even his first work on Daredevil, where he first begins to write, you look at that and you imagine that drawn by a different artist, and those are still powerful stories of a superhero done in a way that had not been done before. And as the writers began to do stories that were groundbreaking, that brought them to parity with the artists commercially. And that's still going on right now. Alison Bechdel is a wonderful cartoonist, draws beautifully, but the power of Fun Home, its ability to have translated to Broadway with the success, is in great part the story she wrote. Some of that is because of her personal life journey and how challenging that was and how she dealt with it. But a great deal is how she managed to capture that as a story using the medium. And I think...
Can I interrupt?
Please.
See, I don't see it that way. I think what made me love comics in the beginning, although I couldn't articulate it at the time, and what makes me love what I'm able to do now, is that it's words and pictures. And it's the interplay of words and pictures. And Funhouse, or Fun Home, wouldn't be nearly as effective as a piece of prose.
Oh, absolutely.
That it's the interplay. And you can't say where the power, it's, are the words better than the pictures? Are the pictures better than the words? If somebody else illustrated it, would be, you can't even imagine it. It seems to me that whether it's one person doing it or two or three people working on it, it has to look as if it comes out of one single sensibility. And that was true always of Will's work. And it was also true, factually true, because whoever worked on it, it was him. It was his creature. And it's the words and pictures aspect of it that made me fall in love with the form, and that makes me love it now. The magic and in combining these things and changing time, the use of silence, all of the different things that, for years I've said that the greatest single example of words and pictures I've seen was the Sunday page in Terry and the Pirates after Raven Sherman is thrown from a truck and Terry Lee and Dude Hennick are walking away after burying her body. And it's 12 panels that looks like 10 hours of time and feels like it. And most of it is silent panels, and every once in a while there's talk. And you feel the passage of time. You feel the, based on long shots and color and this and that. It is what a brilliant cartoonist, using his art form to the hilt, the combination of words and pictures and color and time and silence and this and that, and even where the balloons are placed on the page and where they're not, all of this, I sat, when I got into this in terms of studying it, dazzled over and over again by staring at this.
I want to pick up on something in that, because I think it's one of the hearts of comics. The use of time. Comics are truly unique in both how the creators of them are able to use time, but also how the reader participates in the time decision. It really is the most controlled by the reader of the major media. You go into a film and you're experiencing the film at the pace the director wants you to experience it. Television, certainly the same thing. Prose you can read at different speeds, but you have only one path to absorption of it. You can go back and reread a section, but it's still in the control of the author. Comics, the reader can take in the establishing shot and spend the time to really look at each head and wonder what each of you will be and what question you will ask and which one of you might be the secret assassin. Or simply say, yes, there's an audience full of people and there's two guys talking at the beginning of the room and I'm moving on. That ability to control your experience of reading it is, I think, one of the fundamental magics of comics.
And one of the things I learned in doing my first graphic novel, Kill My Mother, is that once I've written the dialogue and you write it, it's typed up in the conventional form. Once I got to learning how to adapt it to the page, it was like the director of a film changing the writer's lines because they didn't fit, because he had another shot set up. He had something else in mind. And I found, depending on how I wanted my characters to react, what I thought the story was here, what I wanted the emotion to be on the page, whether the focus was on the person speaking or the person listening, because listening, it's all about behavior and how people, the body language and how we behave. Learning how to do all of this and learning, first of all, that these were important questions that hadn't dawned on me when I started entering this work. And now as I continue this work, I find that the questions keep opening it up and opening it up and opening it up. Not in grueling school-like words, oh Jesus, but as fun. It's joy because you discover that this is endless. This opening and opening and opening. There's so much you can say. There's so many ways to tell a story.
When it's a good collaboration, and since I can't do the artist's job, I can only speak to the collaborative version of it. It's a game of can you top this?
Yes.
I'll create a script and then be fascinated by what the artist does with it. I've had the privilege of working with so many really wonderfully talented artists. And then you start changing your script and adjusting it to match what you see in the artist's work. And if you had infinite time, the process could go on infinitely. Mercifully, there are deadlines, and at some point you just say, yes, this is as wonderful as we're going to get by Tuesday.
And I'm sure that there are times when you have written something knowing full well how to illustrate it, and the only way it can be illustrated, and it came back done differently, and you look at it and say, well, this is much better.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I mean, I found out with plays, where my director would do a scene that I had directed in my head, and where the actors had lines perfectly done in my head. And the scene would be done differently, the actors would act it differently, and as soon as they did, they rewrote what was in my head. And I couldn't remember what was in my head anymore.
Well, because it didn't matter. You could,
No,
you could,
well,
you
they-
could
they-
see and participate
It was
in the better
collaboration.
version.
They had improved on, I mean, that's what collaborative art is.
Next question.
Hi. I was wondering what Mr. Eisner might have thought, especially given what you were saying about his attitude about the comics in general, feeling a little maybe chip on his shoulder about the industry or the medium. What he felt about some of the artists that came after him, especially in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that really built even more strongly on things that he had pioneered. And did he follow still things that were going on? Did he feel a sort of pride in, look what I've opened the door to, or, oh, these guys are just knocking me off? Or, how did he feel about the progress of the industry during that time?
Did you spend any time
No,
socially
I
with
think
Will
that's
in
something
those
for you
years?
to talk about.
I mean,
Really didn't see Will during this period. I know, from what I've read, how he, as this older man who shouldn't have gone for this stuff, he went hook, line, and sinker, was fascinated by everything.
and I think when he comes back into the field in '71. It's probably his second comic convention, and he begins a relationship with Dennis Kitchen, which is a profoundly beneficial friendship. And Will, at least at that point in his life, was an extraordinarily curious man. He was fascinated to see what was going on. Some of it with the fascination of you're looking at a traffic accident was, what are these kids doing over here? But some of it was, oh, they've figured out how to do something very different. What does this mean? Can I be a part of this? Can I capture some of the energy of it? And I think in his later stage, when he was doing the graphic novels, I think he took a lot of delight in the work of others, arguing with them sometimes. There's a whole book of his discussions with Frank, and they shared, I think, a very profound respect for each other's work and a profound disrespect for some of each other's opinions, in a very healthy fashion. But I think he was enormously gratified and occasionally enormously jealous. The same reaction that you talked about, Will, occasionally having to your successes in the different forms, or maybe not even so much the successes, but the respect granted to your work because of its fashion. I think that was one of the challenges I touch on in his relationship with Art Spiegelman.
Yes, you said it's a mixed relationship, and talk some money, but you didn't go into detail, can you?
I think a piece of it, Art had great respect for what Will had done particularly in the Spirit and in the early days, some respect for what Will did in the graphic novel period, great disrespect for Will's work with the Army, on the principle that it was for the Army.
Well, I share that.
I think Will, in turn, had great respect for the creative work that Art did. I mean, it's very hard not to have great respect for a piece of work like Mouse, which is so incredibly thought out. But I think he had a certain level of jealousy or frustration at seeing Mouse win the Pulitzer and be regarded. Part of it was, yeah, this is great, comics have finally gotten the respect, and part of it was, it should have been me. And not necessarily that he had a particular work that he thought was more deserving than Mouse, or that he didn't think that Art's work on that was deserving, but it was Moses standing outside the promised land and looking at the guy having a really great time in the land of milk and honey.
I can understand the feeling, but it's unwarranted. I mean, Art, in one fell swoop, had created over a period of, 5, maybe 10, almost 10 years, I guess it was, a piece of literature. It was literature. It was the
Extraordinary
unlike,
literature.
What?
Extraordinary literature.
Yes, and assuming that he got this attention because it was the Holocaust that was the subject matter, so of course, is misleading. I mean, I'm sure that's why some of the attention did go to it, but it was really a family story about a father who was a hero during the Holocaust and helped the family survive, and who was a royal pain in the ass when he was here, working with his son, who he didn't understand, complained a lot to, and was an old Jewish man who wasn't a hero at all. And the play, the juxtaposition of those two, and the conversations about it going on back and forth, was, I remember when I first read it, stunning. Because he had complete control over this story of human behavior that all of us have witnessed with, who have parents and remember the parents and are amazed that they were different people in their youth and did heroic things, and now they are, leave me alone. They're royal pains in the ass. Would you leave me alone? And nobody documented that more persuasively or more brilliantly than Art.
The other piece on Mouse, they did an exhibit at the Jewish Museum here of Art's preliminary work.
Yes.
You can't even call it script because it's so much more than script. It's the preliminary work that a painter would do as his roughs for doing an extraordinarily complicated painting for each page, even though the work was not painted. I've experienced a very, very wide variety of creative processes in my years in this business because of the seats I sat in. I have never seen a piece of comics work thought out in that level of detail and that level of self-analysis.
And over again, the same pages.
Yeah. So I think whatever jealousy there was of the result of Art's work, I don't think it was a disregard for the quality of the work or for Art's intentions or anything. It just was, it would have been nice if that was me. My life should have ended that way, or should have included that. And that's only human. And Will was a profoundly human being. Wonderful in many ways, flawed like all the rest of us are in some of the ways.
But also, as I said about myself earlier, Art loved being a cartoonist. That's all he could imagine himself being. And to him that meant investigating the form, playing with the form, trying to do new things with the form. He was a publisher, but he didn't see himself as a businessman.
Right.
He's been an editor. He didn't see himself primarily as an editor. He didn't think being a publisher and an editor was more respectful than being a cartoonist.
I think those were just means to an end. I think if he had not become involved with Francoise, the whole editor and publisher side would never have emerged. It was those were her gifts to him in part.
But he did not forget what he was primarily, and Will at times in his career was eager to forget what he was primarily, until these tragedies hit him and his life changed, and he sadly but brilliantly moved back to what he should have been doing in the first place.
I think we have time for another question or two, if we have another question or two. Sure, but grab the mic, please.
This actually dovetails with what you've just been talking about. What Will does get the acclaim for is Contract with God being the first graphic novel, and yet, and this actually, Paul, is a question directed towards you, without having read your book, obviously, it's still being discussed as to, is Contract with God the first, quote, graphic novel, given that it's a collection of short stories, and should the acclaim, Steranko believes it should be Chandler, and Gil Kane fans believe it should be Black Mark from 1971. So I just want to know, even though he didn't get the Pulitzer like Mouse did, his acclaim is the father of the graphic novel, and yet isn't that still controversial?
Well, you don't even have to buy the book. You can go on vulture.com and read the chapter about the coming of the graphic novel, and you can see my thesis on that. But the short form answer is the reason the book is Will Eisner, champion of the graphic novel, is that I think his seminal impact was what he did to Frank, and what he did to Alan Moore, and what he did to Neil Gaiman.
Right.
Art would have an impact like that as well on a group of people several years later.
Right.
But Contract with God comes out. We haven't seen anything like it remotely for a generation. All of the works you reference, and many others that I talk about in the book, are steps towards it. But it's not about whether a work was published serially first. Most of Dickens was published serially.
Right.
They're novels. We respect them as novels. Conan Doyle's stories came out serially. It was a form of publication. 100,000 people experienced Watchmen as a serial publication. 1.5 million perhaps now have experienced it as a graphic novel. The things that made Contract with God not the first graphic novel, and certainly not even the first modern graphic novel, but such a moving piece of work were a combination of the fact that it dealt with truly adult themes, mortality, religion, sexuality, in a mature way, raising all these ambiguous questions that we have no answer for.
And survival.
Survival.
Right.
I would argue that Harvey Kurtzman's Jungle Book 20 years earlier is the first of that kind, and then you have this long lapse before we get to it. But Contract is more important because it was outrageous. It was not only that it was this creative step into this other territory where Black Mark, wonderful piece of work by Gill and Archie, something I loved as a child, was still a piece of genre work.
And same thing with Chandler, I assume? You feel the same way?
And Chandler's an adaptation. It's leaning on things that are there before.
Right.
Again, brilliant, important, but you look at Contract and it is, first off, this step into themes that have not been touched for a long time in this medium, if at all. It's published physically in this enduring format for really the first thing published that well.
Right.
It's by Will Eisner. He's got the guts to do this. All of those improbable things were more important than the fact that not very many people read it. It was not a commercial success. It didn't open the doors to publishers saying, great, let's find the next graphic novel in the way that Dark Knight or Watchmen or Mouse did when they came about 8 years later, in that wonderful trifecta of being published within such a short period of time that really cracked open the graphic novel racking space. We discount the effect that the process of selling these things has on the process of creating them. Jim Killen is still here somewhere, or bailed out on us. Was here before from Barnes & Noble, who's been a great advocate for the graphic novel for many years. Without a graphic novel section in the bookstore, it would have been hard to build the business the same way. Without the comic shops being the solid business they grew into, it wouldn't have been possible. But Contract comes at a moment when the comic shop is emerging, when the creators' passion for doing these things are bubbling over. All the projects you're talking about come in those couple of years. They're looking for something that says it's possible. And Contract is, God damn, if Will Eisner can do it, yes, he was great, but he's not a radical. He's not done anything that we've seen for 20 years, and he comes back and makes a statement like this. Well, I should be standing up and I should be changing the world, and I think that's a piece of it too.
Great answer. Thanks, Paul.
You can also buy the book, Arlen. It's on sale outside.
I
Gentlemen?
think we have to wrap it up.
Yeah, I think,
Oh, sorry.
sorry, let's take the last 1 and 2, and then we're going to call it a night.
I was just wondering if you could talk about what role Ann Eisner played in Will Eisner's success.
Not killing him? I think there was a wonderful book. Danny, you'd remember the name. What was the name of the book of the stories of the cartoonist's wives?
I have to live with this guy?
I Have to Live with This Guy. I recommend that highly. Women who are willing to be married to artists and writers really are wonderful treasures in life. We're fairly disturbed people and not particularly functional in society. And Anne and Will were a lovely couple. You know, I certainly don't know her as well as I knew Will, because I knew him in professionally in many more lights, but I had the pleasure of having quite a number of meals with the two of them. And she's a charming woman and clearly provided grounding for him. And when you look at the Contract emerges from this tragic moment in their lives, and they came through it with a strong relationship. Her ability to take, I think, most of the heat in the time that Alice was sick, and to hold the marriage together, to hold him together, is probably part of what enabled Contract to happen. I don't think anybody but the two of them really knows the answer to that question. But from what little I know as an outsider, that's what I would bet. Danny?
Gentlemen. Will did spend 20 years doing the PS Magazine.
A little louder, please.
Will spent 20 years doing PS Magazine and other work for hire, I guess, or whatever but things that were not as well known or beloved as The Spirit or the graphic novels. But what role do you think, if any, that material played in his development, and do you think it informed Contract and the graphic novels afterwards?
I think that the challenge of doing commercial comics, custom comics, comics that are predominantly informational, honed a different piece of his craft. Most of the kinds of projects he had to do through there required boiling ideas down to a very simple essence, and ideas that weren't his own. The joy of cartooning, the joy of writing comics, comes from telling your own stories. When you are given someone else's story to tell, and particularly when it's not a very interesting story, yes, you too can learn to work an adding machine. This will be a machine of the future. Still wish we'd been able to squeeze that piece into the book. It was a beautiful one. If you can learn to communicate that in a reasonably interesting fashion, your skill is getting better at communicating what you really want to tell. Is this a provable argument? Absolutely not.
Well, you're a lot kinder than I feel about this. I think
I'm not arguing that it was a well-spent 20 years, Jules, just that he got something out of it.
I think it was 20 years of holding his breath. And when he finally let it out, it was a sizable accomplishment.
So in terms of holding your breath, we're not going to ask you guys to hold your breath anymore. Thank you for coming out on this evening and joining us. Thank you for being interested in Will's legacy and helping carry it forward. And thank you, Jules, for schlepping and for sharing with us and for bearing witness.
If not for you, Paul, then who?
Thank you, my friend.